Hi, I'm Gavin Creel, and welcome to the magical world of Mary Poppins. I had the honor of playing Bert in Disney and Cameron Mackintosh's spectacular production of Mary Poppins in London's West End. So I'm really excited to be able to take you behind the scenes to find out how the show was created and what it takes to make it happen every night. So, let's get started. Many people don't realize that Mary Poppins first appeared in a series of books written over 75 years ago. The history of this iconic character includes a long journey as she traveled from book to screen to stage. But what do we know of her origins? And just as importantly, what do we know of Pamela Travers, the woman whose imagination created Mary Poppins? Well, let's find out.
Pamela Travers was born Pamela Lyndon Gough in Australia in 1899. She grew up reading everything that she could possibly get to read and very soon started telling her own stories. She had this idea of this person called Mary Poppins who comes into people's lives and changes them.
But surely ideas that last the test of time like Mary has don't just pop into a writer's imagination out of thin air, right? So who were the people in P.L. Travers' life that inspired the much-loved character?
There was someone in P.L. Travers' early life who I think had a big impact on the creation of Mary Poppins. It was an aunt of hers, her mother's sister, and she was a kind of no-nonsense, stiff and starchy person. The other very strong influence was a maid who worked for the Travers family, who had an umbrella with a parrot head handle to it. I asked P.L. Travers if she'd ever known anybody like Mary Poppins, and she turned rather acervically to me and said, "Well, have you ever met anyone like Mary Poppins?" And I, of course, said, no, of course I hadn't. But if I'm honest, I'd say, yes, I had met someone like Mary Poppins, and it was P.L. Travers.
So there are clues to the origins of the character that would become Mary Poppins, but what would P.L. Travers herself have to say?
She would say to you that she has no idea where she came from, that she just appeared one day, that she magically appeared to her. And I'm not so sure that that's not true.
One of the things I find very interesting, we're talking about her in London, and not very far from here, in Fleet Street, was an office where she used to go once a week and send copy to Australian newspapers. And on the way down there, she would see at the end of the road St Paul's Cathedral. And of course St Paul's figures very centrally in the story, the first book, and also in the film and the show. And on the way to St Paul's Cathedral, she would have passed on the left-hand side of Fleet Street a little road, a tiny little road, called Poppins Court. I wondered whether maybe that name came to her as being a very intriguing name that she saw on a nameplate on a street in London.
So, with a series of successful books enthralling and entertaining people across the globe, it was only a matter of time before the character came to the attention of one of the world's most famous movie makers.
Walt Disney's daughters, Diane and Sharon, were reading the Mary Poppins books. Walt discovered them through that and said, wait, it's a magical nanny, she lives in England, you know, he was an Anglophile, he loved those stories. This seemed perfect for an animated movie.
Walt and his brother Roy began discussions with P.L. Travers in 1944, beginning a lengthy process to take her beloved character from the written page to Disney's silver screen. Travers didn't particularly like the idea of an animated movie, and it was hard to agree on the way the story would be structured. But the project began to take shape when the creative team was joined by a now legendary songwriting team, the Sherman Brothers.
Richard and Robert were actually handed the first Mary Poppins book by Walt Disney, who didn't really know what he wanted to do with the movie, and he gave it to them first. And the first breakdowns of the story were created by them and a storyman named Don DeGrady.
She'd written enchanting stories and the wonderful, delightful character. The only trouble was there was no storyline. Who do you root for? Who do you fear? These things are the things that make it happen. And if you don't have a story, a good story, you don't have anything.
Pamela comes all the way to California. This is around 1961, 62-ish, and here's the story pitched out loud. And now she has her own reaction. So extreme was her reaction that Walt Disney leaves the room and says to Richard and Robert Sherman, you deal with her, I'm going to Palm Springs. And he got in his car, drove off the lot, and left them alone for the weekend to work it out with Pamela Travers.
Mrs. Travers was not an easy person to convince of what we were trying to do. She felt that we were like attacking her books, and we were not. We were just sort of using her wonderful, wonderful material to tell a story.
But then she comes to her senses and agrees to let the movie actually get made. The books are, of course, set in the 30s. Pamela set the books in the very time she wrote them in. It was an idea at the Disney Studios and from Richard and Robert Sherman to set it in 1910. It was a time of greater innocence. It predates World War I, as opposed to being in the middle of the Depression. So they moved the time. It's a more glorious place to look at. It's more fun, and it's also more fun from a musical perspective for the music they could play with.
So one of the first songs we wrote to get that style was, "Oh, it's a jolly holiday with Mary. Mary makes your heart so light. When the day is gray and ordinary, Mary makes the sun shine bright." That was the style, that wonderful, jaunty English music hall style. And when Walt heard that, he really liked it. He knew what we were going for then.
Then you have the big trick. Who's going to play Mary Poppins? It was Walt Disney's secretary who said, "You have to go to New York and see this young woman in Camelot." And Walt Disney goes to see Camelot, and by this time he's a very famous man. And he goes backstage to see Julie Andrews. And right there in the dressing room asks her if she'd play Mary Poppins for him.
With Julie Andrews in the title role, the film went into production, combining live-action footage with animation to create some of the most striking sequences ever seen on film. At the world premiere in Hollywood in 1964, the audience gave the film a standing ovation with thunderous applause. Everyone knew that a classic film had been born.
The movie goes on to be nominated for Oscars. It wins its Oscars. It is a triumph for Walt. It's a triumph for everybody in the cast, and probably becomes the most beloved movie made by the Walt Disney Company.